Now, to help us go deeper on this topic of re-rigging the rules, I'm delighted to have as our guest today Marilyn Watkins. She's the Policy Director at the Economic Opportunity Institute based in Seattle. Marilyn, welcome.
Good to be here.
So I want to just back up a little bit and give us some context over these last few decades about how, through a variety of policy actions and omissions, we've gotten to the level of inequality and concentration of opportunity that we have in the United States and in Washington.
Yeah, and you know, these things don't just happen. It's not like the economy's not like the weather, right? We do make the rules, or we don't make the rules. Somebody is making rules get made, right? Someone's making those rules, right? And so through the middle part of the 20th century, post-World War II, we saw decreasing economic inequality. We saw everybody, you know, all boats rising, right? As the economy became more productive, as we became a wealthier country, people up and down the economic ladder benefited. And then starting about 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected president, the rules started to be changed. We had that Reagan revolution. There was, you know, how government became the problem instead of the solution. We had cuts in taxes, especially on the wealthy. And we had deregulation. We had a tax on labor unions so that there was less power among working people. And so what we've seen happen since about 1980 is, instead of as productivity increased, as the total wealth of the United States increased, everyone's wages going up and everyone's incomes going up, what we've seen is there's been this rising gap. So productivity goes up, but pretty much the only people who are really benefiting from all of that economic growth now are the top 1% of our economy. And wages for the vast majority of people, especially from about the middle of the earning spectrum down, those wages have really been flat.
Now, before we get to some of the ways in which your organization is trying to re-rig some of these rules and compress some of that widening gap, I actually want to play devil's advocate for a minute, because one of the arguments that you will hear among economic conservatives is that labor unions themselves are an example of rigging the game and monopolizing certain things in a way that distort what would be the natural flow of a market. And that in order to actually create true dynamism in the economy, you need to re-rig how labor unions work and give people, quote unquote, the right to work and not have to go through the middleman of a union. And so that narrative has been very successful, both in rhetoric and in policy. What have you said to that in both rhetoric and policy? Right.
And, you know, unions are made up of human beings, and no institution made up of human beings is ever going to be perfect. But that said, the research shows quite clearly that in the states where you have higher union density, where a larger percentage of the workforce belongs to a labor union, it's not just people in the unions who are better off, it's everybody in the workforce is better off. You have higher minimum wages, you have people who are earnings of the median earnings, the people at the middle who are what their earnings are higher. The states that have these right-to-work laws, you think of, you know, the South classically, where labor unions have been very weak and are even weaker now. You have very few people unionized throughout much of the South, and wages are low for those folks. They have the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, but everyone does less well in those states.
So I want to talk about a couple of instances of re-rigging the rules that EOI is involved in trying to make our society less unequal in this radical way. One of them is around the question of family leave, and unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, well, the way things work now is if you make lots of money, you probably also get pretty generous workplace benefits. You get sick leave, you get vacation, and maybe about 25% of people in the top earnings also get paid family leave. Think of working at Microsoft, for example. But if you're among the bottom wage earners, you probably don't get, maybe you get a little vacation, but you probably don't get sick leave unless you are in Seattle or one of the other 40 or so jurisdictions that have passed sick leave standards. And you almost certainly don't get any kind of additional paid family leave if you have a new child, if you have a serious family illness, or if you yourself have a really serious medical condition, where you don't need just a day or two off, you actually need several weeks or months out of the workforce. So we actually see here in the U.S. that we have 4 states already that have created programs that work kind of like Social Security or unemployment insurance, where workers and employers pay a little bit into a trust fund. And then when someone has to be out for those long periods of time for a new child, for a serious family member or serious health condition, they get paid out of the trust fund. So their employer's not having to pay them. Their employer can hire a temp or whatever if need be. But this way, it really helps everybody have some of those benefits.
But to your point at the outset of this conversation, you talked about how rules aren't like the weather. I mean, they don't just happen. They get made, right? And so the existing rule set in which paid family leave is essentially the exception rather than the rule, is one that gives us the society we have right now. How do you re-rig that? How do you make it so that the literal and figurative rule is, no, you ought to have paid family leave? How are you starting strategically? Do you start in Seattle? Do you do this as a statewide effort? And how do you change minds on this?
Yeah, well, we've been working on this at the state level for quite some time. And actually, just before the Great Recession hit, in 2007, we came really close to passing a program at the state level. Then the Great Recession came along. We obviously weren't going to get that done. And so that was the point where we turned to looking at doing municipal paid sick leave ordinances, and Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane have all now passed paid sick leave ordinances. And now we have one that was included in the minimum wage ordinance that just passed by initiative in November, that thanks to a vote of about 60% of the voters here in Washington state. But meanwhile, we've now gone back to the state level to work on this statewide program of family medical leave. We've seen that these work really well at the state level, where you have a large pool, just like any insurance program. The larger the pool, the better. We see it working really successfully in other states, and we know we can have it work really successfully here, and in a way where it's not just people who already have a lot and who can already lavish everything on their children who are able to take time to care for their new child or be with a dying parent, say, but people who aren't earning very much also, their children also get the benefits of all of that early nurturing care that we know are going to actually pay off in the long run, both for that child, for the family, and actually for our whole society.
So there's a long run versus short run dimension to this way that you're trying to change the rules, but there's something else which you alluded to in passing, which is a municipal focus versus a state focus.
Right.
And I know on another issue, on, for instance, high income earners, particularly high earners who are deriving a lot of their income from unearned income, capital gains and the rest. Y'all are contemplating different strategies at the city level to re-rig the rules there. Say a quick word about that.
Yeah, there's actually an active conversation going on right now here in the city of Seattle around, there's lots of important public expenses that we need to fund, right? Early learning, housing for homeless folks. There's all sorts of things that we can't afford as a society, which we as a wealthy city feel like we should be doing. So is there a way that we can get more money for those important things? We don't tax wealthy people here in our state very well. We have the most regressive tax structure. You probably talked about this. We don't have an income tax. And we have a lot of people with lots of money. So there's an active conversation going on right now about setting up an excise tax on high income earners here in the city of Seattle, particularly looking at capital gains, interest and dividend income, kind of that unearned income.
So the debate that's going to unfold over this, if this becomes a policy proposal, is going to be a classic one about narratives of for whom rules are rigged, right? And what the starting point is, because from the vantage point, again, if I may play devil's advocate, from the vantage point of super high earners, they're going to say, hey, we're the goose that lays golden eggs for the city of Seattle, and stop touching our wealth. Our wealth will trickle down to everybody else. And the rules should be designed that way. And what you're saying is, again, back to what you were saying earlier about family leave, that no, when you actually change the rules in order to tax some of those, in the language that we were using earlier, kind of rents, unearned benefits of being already privileged, like getting capital gains taxed at a lower rate, it ends up redounding to the benefit of everybody.
That's right. And everybody actually does better when everyone's doing better, right? If you're living in the society with haves and have-nots, where you have to live in a gated community and protect yourself, I think most people would say that the quality of life here in Seattle would be improved if we actually housed all of the people who are homeless, if every kid had a real shot at opportunity. So one of the things I think that's common to both of these policies we've been talking about is the way that we're going to actually successfully get them across the finish line is not by relying on the elites to say, oh yeah, okay, we'll accept this. It's actually by all of the people out there saying, hey, you know what? This is not just a good idea, but we're going to actually fight hard. We're going to contact our elected officials and tell them this is what we want. We're going to show up when it's crucial to show up and actually demand that our public officials who are representing us actually pass these policies that are going to be good for us, for our families, and our communities.
Well, that is a call for bottom-up people power right now. And Marilyn Watkins, thank you for joining us to make the case for that kind of power.
It's great to be here today. Thanks, Eric.
My guest today has been Marilyn Watkins. She's the policy director at the Economic Opportunity Institute. Thanks for joining us.